This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject will be racial and sexual identity in modern life, and I will have three people who will talk about that. They are Nicholas Wade, Sven Backlund, and John Robson, and when I return, we will get more into the subject and more into who they are. Well, I'd like to begin the show by letting each of the three panelists introduce themselves, what they do, who they are, if they have any websites or any books that they want to talk about too, because we will be referencing them as we go along. So from left to right, let me start with Nicholas Wade. Nicholas, if you could just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your career and your book.
Well, I'm a journalist. I've written about science the most of my life. I started out on Nature, a scientific journal, then I went to Science, which is its American equivalent, and then I moved to the New York Times, where I've been an editorial writer and science editor and a science reporter. So in the course of reporting the world post-genome, I've looked around for several books to write on subjects that explain how new aspects of the genome. So I've written one on early human history and another on religion and a third one on race, which you referred to, that came out last year.
Sven Backlund, you are a researcher into, I guess, human sexuality, and I had first come upon you about 7 or 8 years ago in an article in Discover magazine. And if you could just tell a little bit about yourself and the research that you do.
Yeah, that's right. I'm actually a molecular geneticist, meaning I work with DNA. I don't actually talk to people. I don't actually find out much about who they are, but we try to figure out how they've become who they are. And we focus in our lab on sexual development. And that could be biological sexual development, so development of testes and ovaries, but we also look at the brain. We look at gender identity, and we've studied brain differences in transsexuals. And my research has been mostly focused on sexual orientation, so what they call the gay gene, or basically the straight genes, because that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and I wanted to interview you because I found that to be an interesting article, and one of the things we will talk about is not only just homosexuality, but things such as Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner and sexual identity. And I know you're not an expert on that per se, but certain of the things that you have researched will certainly have some bearing on that. Getting to that, John Robson, you have a website, your own website, John Robson Online, and I know I found you by looking up an article that you did not on Caitlyn Jenner, but on a woman named Rachel Dolezal, a white woman trying to pass off as black, and you had written an article about it. So if you could give a little background about yourself and any opinions relevant to the topics at hand.
Dan, a journalist and documentary maker. My latest project, Magna Carta, Our Shared Legacy of Liberty. You can find it, Magna Carta documentary online. But I was trained as a historian. I worked in academia, I worked in think tanks, and I've always been very interested in the role of ideas and how essential it is to understand what people think about themselves and their society, to understand what they're doing. And one of the ideas that's been enormously influential ever since the 1960s, the coming of the civil rights movement, and the discovery that in the Western world we had been terribly wrong on race. There has been this presumption that existing social institutions, existing social attitudes are necessarily wrong and necessarily harmful, and we just can't wait to find the next barrier to break, the next taboo to transgress. And this has therefore translated over to all kinds of things, including sexuality, since we realized there are no significant differences between whites and blacks. We got that terribly wrong. There must be no significant differences between women. And so this idea, now 50 years old, all before it, but it's two places that I think are misleading and frequently quite dangerous. And so I posed the challenge in an article: if a man can turn into a woman, why can't a white turn into a black? Especially if you buy into this notion that it's all in the mind, that we are whatever we think we are.
I just lost your video, John. If you could turn it back on. Are you still there, John?
I'm still here.
Okay, yeah, I have your picture, but if you can try to get your video back up. Well, let me start with that and go down the panel. and let me start with Nicholas, since he had written a book on race. I know I'm pretty much a social moderate, and while I don't believe that in things like phrenology or whatnot, the thing with race is, to me, it's a superficial thing, but it's also a real thing. And I think a lot of people nowadays in the sciences, especially on the left, try to look at race or racial identity, whether you're talking about 3 or 4 stocks of man, or if you want to talk about nationalities as races or subspecies. It seems to me that people want to gloss over the fact that there are differences, that even babies, I've read about studies where babies can identify people racially, that just because it's a superficial difference, it's not a real difference. So Nicholas, is that one of the premises that you've come upon, that people either take these hard positions that there are no such thing as a race, or that they have these old line sort of 19th century beliefs about race?
Well, it certainly would be nice if there were no such thing as race that divides our societies. But race does exist in a biological sense, although this is frequently denied by many social scientists who claim that race is a social construct, not a biological one. So part of the purpose of my book was to look at all the information we have streaming out of the human genome that certainly bears on race, and to say, well, race is real, race does exist biologically. So what one makes of that is another matter, but one can define race so precisely that, for example, with people of mixed race, like African Americans, the geneticists can sort of track along their chromosomes, saying, well, this section comes from a European parent and this from an African parent, which an exercise that obviously would be impossible if race didn't exist. So, in my view, it's much better if social scientists drop this fiction that race doesn't exist biologically and accepted it. And I argue in my book that this is really no big deal, that in fact the more closely you understand race, the more clearly you see that humankind is a single species with just a few minor wrinkles and variations in it.
I know a lot of times, like back in the 1990s, there were several books that would, try to link race with intelligence quotient, and forgetting the idea that IQ tests, to me, are quite troublesome in many ways, aside from race. It seems to me that when people make, at least here in the United States of America, when people make broad sweeping assumptions about race, they generally still fall back onto these things that all people are some way or another. Now, it's not the old 19th century standard, but for example, in sports, which dominates a lot of the American landscape, you now have the idea that, for example, many people of African American black descent are somehow physically superior to their white counterparts, when to me that seems really kind of silly, because if you have a group that's disadvantaged into getting into, say, becoming lawyers or doctors or CEOs, they're naturally going to go towards something that's easier to succeed in, like sports. And I think the history of American sports, for example, boxing, with first Jews, the Irish, Hispanics, blacks, all having their sort of turns in a dominant role in those sports, seems to argue for the fact that economic opportunity tends to be behind what we perceive as racial differences. Would you agree with that?
Yes, to both parts of your statement. With respect to intelligence, it's certainly true that the IQ issue has sort of poisoned discussion of racial differences. And I think it's best to simply acknowledge the fact that although IQ tests do have major validity applied to individuals, for example, in showing some correlation between IQ and economic success, it's very hard to compare the IQs of different populations unless you're absolutely sure that all other conditions are the same, which you never are. So it's known that health, for example, is a major factor that affects the IQ scores. Moreover, just let me just say that you're on very shaky grounds almost almost always when you try and compare the IQ scores of different races. So it's better to just sort of drop that from the discussion, at least in my view. With respect to sports, I think there probably are genetic differences that underlie some sporting facts. For example, the extraordinary predominance of African Americans in the 100-meter sprint, which I think that is, I think I'm right in saying that's all dominated by African Americans. You're right that cultural factors such as the preeminence of Jews in boxing in the 1920s often have a major role in sports. But I think you can assume that once you get to Olympic level in the sort of present day and age, that many of these cultural factors have been ironed out, and you are, in many cases, seeing a genuine physiological difference between races. I say that on general grounds, since races do differ, and since some of these differences are, I would say, little more than superficial, because why should they be just superficial?
Well,
these races do exist, because these differences do exist, there's no reason that every race should perform exactly the same extent in every given athletic activity.
Sven, you look like, okay, I'm sorry. Sven, you look like you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I have two thoughts that I want to add to that. So I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson explain that when he told people that he wanted to be an astrophysicist, people said, "Are you sure you don't want to play basketball instead?" And that's really that cultural part that you were mentioning. But I find it personally very fascinating as a geneticist. I'm really interested in genetic differences between races, and that's kind of a taboo topic. I don't think people are really very much focused on that. I want to give you two examples. So everyone except for Africans has Neanderthal DNA in them.
Yeah.
So when we, us humans, a long time ago, traveled north from Africa, we encountered Neanderthalers and had sex with them, quite a bit of sex apparently, because we have a good percent or so or more of their DNA in us, their genes in us. Now, people from Africa don't have any Neanderthaler DNA in them. We don't really know what difference that makes. We don't know if that makes any difference. But purely genetically, people from African descent are more pure human than we are. We have some of the earlier species DNA in us. And the other thing that's really interesting is that if you just talk about Africans, so by some measures, two South Africans that come from tribes that are 100 miles apart have more genetic diversity between the two of them than between a person of African and Asian or African of European origin, just because that's where the human race evolved. And so there's just a small group of people that traveled north and colonized the whole world, where the human race evolved. That's where all the genetic diversity is. So it's a very complex topic.
Yeah.
I don't think it's been studied at all.
Well, also, Sven, wouldn't it be true that African Americans, as they're now called, are going to have a large portion of European DNA in them? I mean, versus, say, someone who's a Khoisan in the southern part of Africa, which would be, a pure African. If you took your average, say, black athlete in America and pick your top basketball player or top baseball player, they are probably going to have 20 to 30, 40% European DNA in them because of centuries of race mixing. Would that not be so?
That's true, yeah. When I was talking about Africans, I meant Africans and not necessarily African Americans. And then there's also another taboo topic of kind of what happened to them. And in a way, African Americans are part of a breeding experiment where the strongest one were chosen, that put through a terrible, stressful physical test, and only the ones who survived were then sold and bred like racehorses in a way. And I think that definitely had some effect as well on what genes we have in the United States and people versus back in Africa where they came from.
Well, you touch upon a topic that some people do talk about, supposed the breeding of African slaves for strength, and that's something that's been controversial. John Robson, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you do you have something to add to the things that Sven and Nicholas have talked about?
Well, I think that the very important point you make about African Americans is that they are of extreme mixed ancestry, and I think that to the extent that they do excel at sports, I think you may be seeing hybrid vigor rather than anything particularly African. The other point I would make is that when some humans left Africa, one of the things that became a very real physical priority was not being cold. And you sacrifice a certain amount of speed and agility for the sake of retaining your bodily warmth. I speak as someone of partly Scottish descent, and obviously being shaped like a barrel is an impediment when you're sprinting, but it's something of an advantage in the Outer Hebrides. So I think that the primary driver of evolution among humans, many, many years ago, we put most of our eggs in the basket of intelligence, and particularly of skill and cooperation, at doing things well together and detecting cheaters. And that evolutionary pressure has been the same on everybody, regardless of where they lived. And that is why I think that you do see some physical differences. Again, you look at sprinting results at the Olympics, people of West African descent tend to dominate. Long-distance runners, people of East African descent. And, you don't bet on a Scotsman in the 100-yard dash. You just don't. But when it comes to the things that really matter to us living together as human beings, what you're looking at is a result of intellectual and psychological evolutionary pressures that were the same virtually everywhere.
Well, let me turn back to Sven and talk about sexuality for a moment, because this year that we were recording, 2015, in the United States of America, the Supreme Court of the U.S. did legalize gay or homosexual marriage after about a 10-year legal battle. And I have to say, I was frankly stunned. I'm of a socially liberal bent, so I always supported that, and I'd also support polygamy or anything else between consenting adults. But I thought it was going to take about 25 years, frankly, that it would happen. I think it was some brilliant legal strategy. But I know in the article that I first found Sven in some years ago, one of the things that I found interesting was in the 1990s, you had the idea of a gay brain or a gay gene. Recently this year, there was 2 or 3 months ago, there was a recurrence of the idea that there was, if not a gay gene, a sequence of genes that if they fell into line could produce someone, or at least a male who is homosexual. So let me just talk about the scientific basis for homosexuality versus any cultural basis. And one of the things I know, having been in the arts for 30 years, is there's always been a divide between male homosexuals and female homosexuals, with a lot of female homosexuals or lesbians always taking a political stance about their sexuality, the whole kind of man-hating thing, and that they chose lesbianism. What in your research, Sven, do you see in terms of sexuality where we are in 2015, and what is the likelihood, do you think, that there is a biological basis somehow, whether it's genetic or something else, for human homosexuality?
Well, I will address the differences between men and women in a second, and remind me of it if I don't. But I think the best way to think about sexuality is not so much about thinking about homosexuality, but just about heterosexuality. And once you think of that, it's obvious that that's genetic. If you look around in the world, animals come in 2 species. That's not a coincidence. Could have been 3 or 5, but there's 2. And it's highly conserved. And for them to reproduce, for species to continue existing, the males have to mate with the females. So that means you somehow have to know what your sex is, what the sex is of another individual that you encounter is, and then whether that means you want to stick body parts into each other. And so that mechanism must be very old and very conserved. And a crocodile is not straight because of their upbringing or the school they go to or what religion their parents belong to. A crocodile is straight because that's what they are. And I think so that on a very primitive level, that is just the same for us. I think there's genes that regulate sexual orientation, and we know at least of 2. We know of one on the X chromosome, and we know of one on chromosome 8. And but frankly, that's all we know. We have no idea how they work. We have no idea what these genes do, and we have no idea what effect they have on our brains. But we know that they exist. That there's variations in these genes that are correlated with being gay in men, at least. And again, if you think about the animal kingdom, it's kind of obvious that that's the core fundamental interaction is somehow regulated biologically.
Well, before we get to the male versus female homosexuality, let me just ask you a question, and you can tell me if I'm full of shit or not. I've always had cats, and oftentimes with my male cats, they get into, the dominance male sex play. One of them mounts the other, bites on the scruff of the other, and tries to make him submit. Now, if you're far enough away, that looks like a sex act, and I'm wondering if it's possible that in a cultural sense, homosexuality may have, at least male homosexuality, may have developed from some of that, because human beings, since we developed an intellect that can know the self rather than just follow these drives that my cats follow, could homosexuality have developed out of what was essentially dominance play between, let's say, Homo sapiens predecessors?
Well, that's a tricky question. My first thought is no, that doesn't sound right to me. But let me think if I have anything clever or scientifically to say about that. So, if you are 14 years old and you realize that you're attracted to guys and not to girls, or not so much to girls, typically at that age, I think at that point that has very little to do with whether an ancestor wanted to dominate another ancestor. I think at that point, that is purely an attraction that you didn't choose, that you don't know what to do with typically. And so that's a non-answer, but I think what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't really matter where that came from, I think, because we'll never be able to answer that question.
Okay, and let's get back to then lesbians versus male homosexuality. As I said, after 3 decades in the arts, back in the 1990s especially, I know there was sort of there was always almost a militant divide between a lot of lesbians and male homosexualities, with this sort of, I guess maybe shows like the Oprah Winfrey Show talked more openly about supposed sexual abuse of women, and a lot of women would claim that they became lesbians because they had been abused as children and whatnot. Do you look back on that now with 15 or 20 years hindsight and say, well, that was just a sort of political posturing? Do you believe, as strong a scientific basis for female homosexuality as for male homosexuality?
When my colleagues and kind of predecessors in this research started studying sexual orientation from a biological point of view, they started working with men and with women. And what they found was that if you ask questions like, who are you attracted to? When you walk on the street, you turn your head for someone, is that a man or a woman? Who do you fantasize about? Who do you actually have sex with? If you ask these questions to men and women, for men, you get a very extreme pattern where you have people on one end of the spectrum and people at the other end of the spectrum, and very, very few guys in between. If you ask the exact same questions to women, you get an entirely different distribution, where the majority of women is somewhere in the middle, and there's very little on the extreme. And so, on top of that, women seem to be, most women, not all of them, seem to have some flexibility that men don't have, and they can actually cross and can say, well, I'm done with men, let me try dating women. There's very few men that can actually do that can make that conscious decision. So I think, in general, again, there's a lot of exceptions, but in general, I think female sexuality is a lot more fluid, and there's a lot more room for conscious decision-making, and they can make it work somehow in a way that men can't.
Well, that's a good segue. Let me just turn to John Robson to end this segment, because you're talking about women and fluidity. The article you had written upon this woman, Rachel Dolezal, who was pretending to be black, I think is a perfect example. There was a term that came in the 1990s in America with rap music lovers who weren't black called wiggers, or white niggers, and where a lot of suburban white kids pretended that they were black and they would talk in black slang and that kind of thing. What is your take on someone like a Dolezal? And you had, in your article, you had talked about, and you just earlier mentioned that you felt that there was, if people can pretend, or Bruce Jenner wants to claim that he's female gender, even though he's male sex, why can't Dolezal claim a different cultural heritage? So I guess my question is, where do you, what are your thoughts, John, about that? Do you think that race or ethnicity is as fluid as sexuality for most people? John, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh,
The
okay.
last bit of your question broke up, but I find that we've got this backwards in the modern world. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that we treat gender as non-existent and race as existent and say that, oh, these white kids are acting black as though there was some inherent way of being black. In fact, if you look at Black American culture, you see strong traces of the acculturation of slaves primarily, but also free blacks, into what is essentially hillbilly culture. That the people most willing to associate socially with slaves would have been the people in the backcountry, and the style of speech, the attitudes towards gender, level of violence, all kinds of things match up quite closely because human beings really are all the same under the skin. And so if somebody comes along and finds a humorous way of talking, you're liable to adopt it. It doesn't matter if this is, you find some Jewish comedian funny and you start to adopt some of those rhythms though you're not Jewish, or you find the speech of some cultural group exceptionally to the point, and you think that's directness. I should be more like that. But when it comes to gender, everybody has always known that men and women are different. Vive la différence. That used to be the French slogan. Now it's like nier la différence or something. And when you get to the question of homosexuality and how homosexuality works, the question that used to, I think, be asked legitimately is, well, where does it fit on the male-female spectrum? For instance, when gay marriage was first being pushed as a major issue, and activists would say, our relationships are just the same as yours. Then I thought, okay, there must be a husband and a wife in a relationship. They may both be male, they may both be female, but one picks up the newspaper, the other one starts to talk, as it is with men and women. But then suddenly they said, oh, no, there aren't men and women. There's no such thing. There's no continuum. There's no spectrum. There's no characteristically male behavior or female behavior. There's no more typical male kind of brain organization. And so that was all just abolished. And at the same time, we turned around and said, oh, but there is such a thing as blackness. You're not really black if, or in Canada where Aboriginal issues are very big, you're not a real Aboriginal if, or, the red man has a special relationship with the earth. And I'm thinking, what are you saying? If I'm white, I should dump paint in the river? Good grief. If I come along and discover that some culture understands better than I do how to respect nature, I want to respect nature. I should learn from them. Well, again, some Aboriginal society has had enough of that stuff and goes and gets a job in a bank and say, oh, you're an apple, you're red on the outside, white on the inside, as though culture were not meant to be fluid and we shouldn't all adopt best practices. So I think we've got it completely backwards, and it brings up all kinds of questions about race. And you mentioned polygamy. We'll get back to that, I'm sure. I mean, in some sense, if there's no such thing as gender, why not polygamy? But also, if there's no such thing as gender, why are most of us either heterosexual or homosexual? Why are we all just all over the map? Because we're not.
Yeah. Well, let's end this segment. I just want my one comment to you, John, is that I know one of the things here in America, we have a term called the magical Negro that's come along in the last few years with generally films and television shows which show supposedly nature in touch black people guiding along stupid white folks. And I know that probably that a predecessor of that is sort of what the Native American, or as you call them in Canada, the First Nations peoples who are in touch with nature. But it should be stated that the destruction of North American megafauna happened about 10,000 years ago, and there were no white people in America at the time. The people who likely drove those animals to extinction were the ancestors of the nature-loving Native Americans. But let's end this segment, and when we get back, I want to start talking about race from a historical perspective. I want to talk a bit more about Nicholas's book and how race has been perceived over the centuries, as well as sexuality, and we'll do that in a moment. In this segment, I would like to sort of take a step back and talk about both race and sexuality from a more historical perspective over the last few centuries. And let me start with Nicholas. Welcome back, John. Let me start with Nicholas. And let's talk about specifically American, but I guess we could call the new world views on race. So if you want, if we could go back even a couple of thousand years, because I don't think the modern idea of race was as relevant, say in the Roman era. When they spoke of races, they would speak of barbarians, the Romans, the Africans, or whatnot. So what is the history of human idea about race, say going back centuries, Nicholas?
Well, you probably need to be a better historian than I am to really good answer to that. I think race has become much more important in recent times with increasing sort of travel and exploration. It's only in the 19th century.
We lost Nicholas Wade, but hopefully we'll get him back in a few minutes, and we'll get back to a bit more historical perspective on race. Let me then start with that topic and start with John Robson. John, you have taken I guess you would say, a different position than Nicholas has regarding race. Since you live in Canada, let's talk a little bit about how maybe race is viewed differently to our neighbors to the north. Canada is a diverse nation, but it's about 1/10 the size of America. I think it outlawed slavery maybe decades, if not a century, before America, and probably racial issues in Canada probably have more to do with Native Americans or First Nations people, as you call them. Would that be correct?
I'm terribly sorry, that question broke up too much. I didn't get it.
I was saying that in Canada, racial issues probably have more to do with the white majority Canadians and First Nations peoples and things like the upper territories and that kind of thing than it would do to say with black and white here in America. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, on the whole, that is true. Canada was primarily white, with the exception of the first inhabitants, and there were issues. For instance, there was with Chinese immigration, there was some serious hostility there. And Canada, the main black population would have been fugitive slaves until really you start to get into the 20th century. But Canada is part of the West, and Canada has the same virtues and many of the same defects as Western civilization, including a hostility to people based on race. And it's true, this was touched on in the last segment, that the ancient world didn't think of race the same way. There was certainly a certain amount of ethnic hostility. And, somebody once advised Romans not to buy Britons as slaves because they're too stupid. But, if you went down to the slave market in Rome, you'd see the ethnic group they just conquered would be on sale. They didn't have this idea that, oh yeah, this group or that group are born to be slaves. That's a Renaissance horror. This notion of Africans is somehow specially suited to it. It's a complicated historical problem how it arose, but it left us with this idea, and then you get into this 19th century scientific racism that starts to claim that there are inherent differences between people that are not based on culture. I mean, yeah, all the people who have a certain appearance may tend to have a certain kind of behavior because people in one place have one culture, people in another place have another culture, but the idea that it was somehow linked to our genes, and if you had a certain skin color and a certain facial bone structure, you would think a certain way. That is quite a modern idea. It's not all progress, and finally, I think we're ridding ourselves of that, but that is really a product of the last 500 years, not the last 5,000 or the last 5 million.
Yeah. Let me turn to. Okay, go ahead, Sven. You got a dog? Okay, hold on. So Sven, let me talk about the idea of sexuality throughout history. When I was a kid, I remember seeing in America there was a PBS special about the life of a famous homosexual in Victorian England called Quentin Crisp, and it was there that I think in Victorian England that we got a lot of sort of the modern negative stereotypes about sort of the swishy kind of homosexual, the flit or the fag or the fairy, those kinds of terms. Whereas when you look back a few thousand years ago, no one had any idea, say, about Alexander the Great and the Macedonians sort of prancing through Persia as they slaughtered thousands. So, and I've also, read about like what they call the gay lisp or the gay accent. Are these generally modern affectations that you would say, or are these things that have been around but simply weren't noted by the dominant scribes of the day?
That's a good question. I don't know about what happened in older times, and some things I think we just, no disrespect to historians, but some things we just can't really figure out because we can't change what's been recorded back then. What I can tell you is that there definitely are some biological differences between gay and straight men on average, and also between gay and straight women on average, with a lot of exceptions. So when you study things like speech or even posture or the way, if you put people on a treadmill and put these little dots on them so you only see the outlines, you can actually, with some success, figure out whether someone is gay or straight just by looking at their gait. And so there's some of that that's definitely, that must be biological in a way that they already are caught at a young age sometimes with kids that are then in later studies turn out to be gay. I was involved a long time ago in organizing gay summer camps for kids that had never seen another gay guy before, ever. And they would show up with their mixtapes, and they'd bring ABBA tapes. This is in Europe. And you think, how is that possible? How can someone who's never spoken with another gay man in their life, how can they be obsessed with ABBA music, disco? I don't understand how that could be biological, but somehow there seems to be something interesting going on. There's definitely a culture as well, and a subculture in a way, and people pick up traits that they think they need to develop their identity. And I think sometimes some gay men, when they come out and they start going to gay bars or get involved in the gay scene, they pick up these more effeminate or characteristics of speech, just like you were discussing earlier. You pick up these kind of things. So I think it's a bit of a combination of two. And why that was not much described before, I have no idea.
Well, I mean, there are certainly professional athletes, boxers, NFL football players that are gay, and they wouldn't fit sort of that. I mean, would they, if you were to mark out their gait, would they fit into that thing that you're talking about?
No, not at all. And the interesting part is that in these traits like gait and speech and all that, where you have more masculine and more feminine traits, when you look at gay men, you just have a much wider spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no difference in the extremes. There's hyper masculine gay men as well, and athletes, top athletes as well. But there's just a broader range. And again, we don't really understand how that works biologically, but we definitely see that.
And what would the correlation be to these more outwardly, seemingly, possibly affected traits to, say, being in the closet or being out or being a flamer versus, is there any kind of correlation? And how would that, for example, would you plot that on a chart of, say, bisexuality? Because I've known a lot of especially gay men who are like, bisexuality is bullshit, and just take a choice. But I would have to assume that I've known some people who claim to have been asexual, that they just don't feel any sexual attraction. So are all of these kinds of things, whether we're talking bisexuality, homosexuality, asexuality, are there possibly notable markers that could be detected or just haven't been detected yet?
All right, there were a whole lot of questions in that question.
Okay.
Let's start with being in the closet or not, depending on how masculine or feminine you are. Well, definitely, if you are what you call flaming, kids like that get really called gay before they realize it. In school, they get bullied a lot more, and so they end up being out a lot more. Guys that fit in better and that are more masculine definitely or often come out much later because they don't have to, but also because they are even more confused. They know that they don't fit in with what they perceive as gay stereotypes. Your question about sexuality, so it's a bit of a complicated topic, but people that have studied this carefully with you can do brain scans to see which part of your brain get excited when you show images of men or women. You can do the same thing by measuring the blood flow in the penis or blood flow in the vagina. And what they find is that there's really very, very few true bisexual men. They exist, but the overwhelming majority of people that call themselves bisexual are kind of following the buy now, gay later category, where people identify as bisexual because it's easy. It's a step towards being gay without really having to give up the chance of heterosexual relations. So it's definitely for many a developmental stage. And then there's also hypersexual straight men, really, who are just so into sex that they like having sex with guys. That's easier to find. And then, of course, there's the true bisexuals, but they're a really small, hard to find group in men, at least.
Well, since we're talking about race and sexuality here, let me just step back, and before I go back to John, have you found in all of your research, are there any ethnic groups that tend to have a higher percentage, perhaps, of homosexuality? For example, I've heard that a lot of the Pacific Islander cultures are very more tolerant of homosexuality than a lot of Western societies. And does that perhaps propagate someone who might be sitting on the fence in that society to become homosexuality? Or is it something that's sort of just fluid? And, over the decades I've heard about, I forget the term, but in Native American societies, there were men who were thought of as females and whatnot. And we'll lead this back into the Bruce Jenner and Rachel Dolezal thing. But do you find that anything having to do with ethnicity or race plays a part in anyone's sexuality?
Well, you gave a number of examples that are well known, and some of them are well studied, where different cultures deal with this identity in a different way. Because the identity, of course, is a social construct. I think the instincts are largely biological. Getting an exact count is very difficult because it depends on what questions you ask, and different cultures will define these questions differently. There's some Muslim cultures where having sex before marriage between a man and a woman could cause you to get killed, and people there have sex with in some rural cultures with either animals or with other males a lot more often. That doesn't make them any more gay. That is just because that's what's available. So I think it's very hard to ask standardized questions about sexual identity that apply to any culture on this planet, and therefore it's hard to compare them, I think.
Okay. Let me turn back to John and race, because in 2015, as I stated, we had the legalization of gay marriage in America, and then a former athlete named Bruce Jenner, and I say this because even though people would know the name now, 20 or 30 years from now, if they're looking on YouTube, they may not, came out, but he didn't come out as homosexual. He came out as a straight guy who just wanted to change his gender, which is a different topic, and we'll get back to that in a bit. But there was also, as I mentioned earlier, an NAACP chapter head, which was a white woman who wanted to be black. And a lot of times you get the idea of cultural appropriation. I know, for example, a lot of black women who loathe white women who go after black men sexually for relationships. In your article that I read, John, and I'll link to that and link to all of the websites for the participants below this video, what are your thoughts about racial identity being as sort of slippery or as easy to move in and out of, say, as perhaps sexual categories? And why do you think there was such an uproar, especially in black communities, about this woman who was the head of a local NAACP?
Well, I think the whole thing is very peculiar because the idea of moving in between racial categories that we generally agree don't exist. And so it's like, switching rooms in a building that has been burned to the ground. You're still outside. And I find this to be very, very odd. And the black Americans who spent hundreds of years being oppressed by the notion that black is different, and they finally get told, you know what, we're sorry, we realized we were wrong about that. Everybody's the same. And they say, heck no, they're not. We're different because we're black. When it worked out so well last time that you're determined to repeat it. I mean, Rachel Dolezal, I think in some ways is just a personal tragedy playing out as a political issue. There's something very odd about her and her life. But, what does it mean to be black? If it means my skin is dark because I have a lot of recent African ancestry, fine. I get that concept. But it says, well, it means that I have to, misbehave in the face of the police or refuse to study mathematics? Is this what you're talking about when you say be properly black? If not, if you're going to come up with a list of things that are good, why can't anybody do them? Heaven knows it's not as though the human race doesn't need to improve its behavior standards. And if you're talking about things that don't work out, why would you say, oh well, I know I shouldn't do that, but since I'm black, I'll do it anyway? Well, there's no logic in that. And you got people who are trying within the black community to say, don't buy into the negative stereotype and adopt it as a badge of pride. Like this horrendous hip hop style with the pants halfway down your butt and so on, which is meant to imitate people who are in a county courthouse and have their belts taken away so they won't hang themselves. If this is your role model, chances are you will wind up there. But it's got nothing. Why would you say, oh, well, I'm saying I just think it's very odd that we would talk about racial categories being fluid or non-fluid because there's just one race. It's the human race. And we all want to try and do the things that are virtuous, that are good, that work for us, and avoid things that are bad for us. And I don't think anybody should be told, oh, because you're black, you have to do this, whether it's a good thing, like you should be able to slam dunk a basketball, or it's a bad thing, like you should be in trouble with the law and have no education and, go around saying the N-word nobody else can say. I just think it's preposterous that we would think in terms of there being specifically racial behaviors. We would say to some guy, hey, that wasn't very Chinese of you. This is not a statement that anybody should ever make to anybody else. It doesn't matter if the person who's making it is Chinese or not.
Well, thanks, John. Let me turn back to Nicholas Wade. And in the 10 minutes or so that we had lost you, I was talking with Sven and John about the history of homosexuality and also whether race and sexuality are fluid. But since you wrote a book about it, let me turn back to how I wanted to start this segment. And let's talk a bit about, before you dropped out, about the history of races and whatnot. And it seems to me that both Sven and John are talking about a very fluid. For those people wondering, we're just having some technical issues. Nicholas Wade had to drop out of the broadcast, and I'll probably follow up in a month or two with him on a solo interview about his book. But let's get back to the topic on hand. I believe we were talking about sort of the fluidity of race and sexuality, and let me turn back to Sven. Well, before I turn back to Sven, with the Rachel Dolezal thing, which was the last thing I believe that we were speaking of, do you think that she would have been as criticized in the reverse if she was trying to pass, as they said in America, and she was, a black woman who looked white, and she was, say, trying to head, some, I guess there's not any white improvement groups, but if she was trying to, say, pass herself off as Armenian or some other white ethnic group? Or do you think that it's just because Black America has been in a minority position in this country that the fear was made because it seemed to be that someone from a majority group was trying to impinge on a minority group?
I think it was people were puzzled by it because the idea of changing race just didn't really occur to them. I'm actually a comedian. I'm a big fan of his, and he was born in Scotland of mixed parentage, and half and half have his team perspective in his own society. He's really funny in Scottish society, but there's doubts that he's Scottish. Scottish isn't a race. And I think in a curious way, nobody really thinks, what, race? They think of people being American, who's being British or being Irish or that. But it's huge to anybody that whiteness mattered except to whites. And so, but if someone come along and said, yes, I'm really black, actually, people would have said, what? No, sorry, I see that you're a skin color. But it's odd. And then Rachel Dolezal is right. You want to be discriminated against as being black when you're not black. Something wrong with your brain. But at the same time, when someone comes along and says, I'm really a man, I'm really a woman, and it's gender. And whereas apparently a woman with certain equipment, a bitch, men, at what point much the same phenomenon. And so, of course, you have homosexuals very male, just, had an attraction to their bodies, were aggressive, the advantage of this is a male way of thinking, maybe more multitasking, did like chick flip. And then you had the homosexuals who were more traditionally fat. The idea of it's really just, I think, having a more style being, his earlier back when he used to smoke, to pull cigarette the fingers and so on. But that whole premise of the male and female existed, that there would be male homosexuals who were more male and male more female. We don't believe that. On Earth, when homosexual couples only have couples. Why would there be two? Why would there be people? Why would three men and two relationship? If it's on body types, because lust with the much more complex phenomenon of romantic. When you're attracted to it, if you're straight, obviously part of it, often to appearance and initial going. But it's the female mind, yin and yang being complementary. The mirror marriage is about that speed from Mars, Venus people sometimes think is and making it work. We talk about homosexual couples now. Gender, we're not allowed to talk about this anymore. So it's men and women, but everybody who's in a male-female relationship knows there are men and women. Was it that classic box? The his and hers, and he's got an on switch, and she's got 55 different knobs and dials. Everybody gets that joke because men are different. Everybody knows, and you get sexuals. And again, I remember this gay marriage. Gay marriage, they'll say, "Oh, this is my husband," and say, "I thought you can have a husband and a wife." Like, husband, how does that even work? And if you could have, if you're a husband, why not just have the three of you? And nobody talk about this. But these must be asked.
Yeah, you were breaking up a bit there, so hopefully I can get most of what you were saying there. Let me turn to Sven, because I had mentioned Bruce Jenner, who now calls himself Caitlyn Jenner, and I know I've seen him interviewed, and I've known what's now called transgender. 25, 30 years ago, there were homosexuals, heterosexuals, and there's transsexuals. Then you got the idea of transgender. People like Jenner, for example, who presumably still has his testicles and penis, yet who dresses as a female, calls himself female. 30 years ago, he would have been called a transvestite. Where does that fall on the human sexuality spectrum? And is that even a form of sexuality? Since a Jenner presumably wants to have sex with women still, is he heterosexual? Where does that fall? And have you ever studied that, or do you know anyone who's ever studied this sort of gray area?
Yeah, there's been a pretty amazing book written by a guy named Mike Bailey at Northwestern University, a professor there, and it's called The Man Who Would Be Queen. And he popularizes an idea that other people have worked on, which is that there really are two types of male to female transsexuals. And this kind of taboo topic, he was not well received by the transgender community. And so these two types are the following. There's basically what they call the homosexual transsexual. These are hyper-feminine gay men that, as kids already, play like girls, act like girls, play with girls, and end up typically transitioning very early because they very early on realize that they just function better as girls than as boys. They typically pass very well as girls because they are very, very feminine. And because they transition early sometimes, especially in European countries, they can block the effect of testosterone, which before it hits in puberty, and just make it work really well. And there's the other type, which is called autogynophile. Auto means self, gyno, woman, phile, loving. So they love themselves as women. That is that awkward name for them. And those are typically straight, very masculine guys that are engineers or maybe top athletes that get married and have kids, and then at age 40 or something, or 50, suddenly realize that for all of their lives, really they were women trapped in the body of a man. And so they're completely separate, these two types. And once you know them, you can spot the difference from miles away. And so what is thought, and this is very controversial, and it's not like it's not a popular idea, but what it's thought is that for them, there's a sort of sexual fetish almost in being a woman, and it's for them much more a sexual thing than it is an identity thing. I hope someone else said this before about Bruce Jenner, and I'm not the first to say this, that he would fall in that category, but I don't know obviously what's going on in his head, but there's really two distinct types. And for that second type, because they transitioned very late, they're also not feminine. You never thought of Bruce Jenner that he was, when he was an athlete, that he was very feminine. So they have to take classes to learn how to speak like a woman, how to sit like a woman, how to walk like a woman. And for them, it just doesn't come naturally. So there's really very distinct types. And I'm sure there's some people that are a combination or fall in the middle, but that's kind of the big secret that the transgender community doesn't really like to hear discussed.
Okay.
And that's much saying there are male and female male that this identity is gone.
Okay, let me just end this segment here, and when we get back, we'll talk a bit more, and we'll try to get a bit better feed here. So let's end this segment and return in a moment. In this final main segment with Sven and John, I want to talk and sort of wrap some ideas up. Sven, in the last segment, you were talking about sort of an idea that a lot of transgender people aren't interested in terms of two different types of male transsexuals, and I was wondering, because I've read people talk about fetishism and narcissism in male homosexualities, and I know as a kid growing up, there was always the joke that the only thing more fickle and self-centered than a teenage girl was a gay guy, and I wonder when you talk about that kind of hyper-masculine guy who may be fetishizing over his own appearance, his own, the guy who needs to have every lock cone perfectly in place. There was the film with Christian Bale made about American Psycho. He played that kind of narcissistic, self-absorbed guy, although he wasn't gay. The character wasn't gay. Is that the type of person that you're referring to, this kind of person who has to be always keeping up with the Joneses, has to have every latest, app on his phone, has to have every little thing to be, with the in crowd?
I don't understand your question. I understand the type that you're describing, but I don't really understand what your question is.
Well, does that relate to that sort of hyper-masculine person, that the second type of transsexual? Would they have those sorts of characteristics, that they are more self-directed, like you were saying, rather than being thinking of themselves as women? They're more about themselves as individuals, irregardless of sex, perhaps?
I don't really have anything clever to answer to that. I don't really know.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Let me just ask, because before I go back to John, who is still having some issues with, I know when I was young and single in my 20s and 30s, there was always the phrase, and it's probably still in personal ads today, the women who go through their bi-curious lesbian phases. And I knew a lot of women, especially in the arts, who, since we haven't talked much about female homosexuality, who would go through these phases in their teen years, college years, or early to mid-20s, who would always be in that sort of bi-curious phase. Then you come back 5 years later, they found Mr. Right, and they right away have a baby. Earlier on, you had suggested that female homosexuality, lesbianism, was more fluid in a sense, in that women may have had more of a choice. What do you think, if anything, might be a biological difference between the two sexes and their homosexuality? And do women over the course of a lifetime have a greater fluidity of, say, between the numbers 1 and 10 on a sexual spectrum scale? Do they sort of bounce around more than men, do you believe?
So yes, there's a lot of studies that indicate that for women on average, and again there are exceptions, but on average there's a bit more fluidity there, and that they have a bit more of a conscious choice. Now, we don't really understand from a biological point of view how any of this works. However, the one thing that I can say is that there's some evidence that for female homosexuality, there's a larger role for prenatal hormones. There's been this idea that's been circulating for decades that something happens in the womb where, depending on how much male hormones you're exposed to in the womb, that somehow affects your sexuality. And the studies that do support that really only support it in women. So there might just be a biological difference, but I think in general, sexuality is a very complex issue, and I don't think we really understand much about how female or male sexuality works per se. Again, my focus has always been more like on the instinct of attraction more than on the whole picture.
And I think I read that you also had done research regarding sets of brothers, and that somehow males who are born later down, the third or fourth brother is more likely to be homosexual than, say, the first born son. What can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. It's not my own research. It was Ray Blanchard, a Canadian, actually, has done most of the work on this. But this is called the older brother effect, and the more older brothers you have, the higher the chance that you're gay. Now, what's really interesting here is that it doesn't matter whether you actually know these older brothers. So if you are the firstborn and you're given up for adoption and adopted into a family with 8 older brothers, you don't have a higher chance to be gay. So this environment that you grow up in doesn't matter. Now, if you're the 8th born male and you've given up for adoption and you don't have any older brothers for your entire life that you know, you still have a much higher chance to be gay. So what really matters is how many male fetuses were in that same womb that you came out of. The only way that people can explain how this could work is with an immune response. So the idea there is that the mother really develops an immune response against this male creature living inside of her. And with every successive pregnancy, it kind of functions as a shot of a vaccine, as an anti-male vaccine in a way that somehow, in ways we don't understand, gives these kids a higher chance to be gay. And so that effect is definitely present, but it's one of probably many effects. It's not going to explain everyone, obviously. What's also interesting here is that study has been, it's very easy to do, right? You ask people, how many older brothers do you have? Are you gay or straight? So this kind of study has been done and replicated all over the world. So they have data that supports this effect in a large number of countries all over the world.
John, let me turn back to you and talk about, since we lost Nicholas, some of the things I want to talk about, I'll have to wait until I can talk to him specifically regarding his book. But you live in Canada, and I wanted to know, Canada now, I think you preceded the U.S. by a decade or so in legalizing gay marriage, and Canada generally is seen as, at least in America, as being more progressive socially on a lot of issues regarding race and sexuality. Where is the state, for example, of acceptance of people of different cultures in Canada? And by that I mean, I was reading recently after I had booked this show about something regarding native tribes up in the Northern Territories and them getting different forms of sovereignty. Do you think that in Canada there may be a breaking away? We've all heard of, say, French Canada wanting to break away. Do you think that some of the native tribes of Northern Canada may try to form their own nation at some point? And if so, what is your opinion on that? Because that seems to me a bit of self-segregation, and that's one of the things with race that has happened. Instead of getting a color-blind society, it seems that the people who were once oppressed because of their color are now trying to sort of fracture away in America under their own sort of ethnic banners.
Yeah, there's a very major problem what you're talking about. It's not just North Canada. It's a North hospitable place. Not a lot of people are Aboriginal otherwise. Throughout, you're completely correct. First name. Everybody's talking about nation-to-nation relationships, and Aboriginal still effectively function in our nation. Over 600 of them. They have only 100 members. They've got no base. They have no way to make a living. If they were different nations, they couldn't create money, they couldn't police their own communities, they couldn't do any of the things that nations do. And our lives, these terms have one election frequently. And they're all dependent on the Canadian government, which not only doesn't stop them from leaving in this kind of environment resentful, I think it encourages it because they know that their situation morally and actually but it's very, very strong to treat people differently on the basis. Again, and I've made this point repeatedly, that the lack of democratic authority that persists on, mostly on reserves, is why nobody would report it if you said, oh, black people don't need democracy, or Chinese people don't need it, or any other race or ethnic group. When it's Aboriginals, you're called a big, you do complain about it. Now, the government has in fact imposed accountability, parents with discoveries about chiefs just scooping up the reserve and building themselves huge salaries, and the chiefs and are paid correction premium equivalent of your state earners. But there's still this backlash, obviously, to accountability act and the question of Indians accountability because they're Indians. And the whole thing is ludicrous. And I've written about this disconnect. Aboriginals read the Canadian apply to them and all money will keep flowing. And the Canadian who grasp what is being said. And the politicians who are pandering to it from Ontario was supposed to start a speech by saying me and then saying I'm seated and not realizing the lawyers they repent the fact that she uttered words because a lot of these Indian people believe they're going to get Canada back. And the great Supreme Court will say, oh yes, all the land is yours. You just have to come. The settlers have to go. But we're born here. You know, my father here. I've not got an ancestral land to. The fundamental distinction is that the distinct one way else thinks another, which is kind of think, well, there's lots of races you think we differently, and you wonder how we never even managed to talk to them. But yeah, huge emphasis on racial settlement in the Aboriginal community, and I think it's business.
Okay. Yeah, you were breaking up a little bit there. Let me wind up this interview with just a few questions here. I'll direct them to Sven, and then I'll let each of you end with a final statement. A couple of things I wanted to just ask, and I'm focusing on Sven simply because you've got the best feed coming, Sven. So I wanted to ask, and this is some questions that I've heard over the years. To what degree do you think, and I know, for example, in the arts, the ugly duck kind of syndrome influences people's sexuality. And by this I mean, and I'll just be frank, if someone is very overweight or if they are considered physically unattractive, or I had mentioned earlier about, for example, with black women in this country, for example, they are very, you'll often see, for example, a good-looking black guy who might go for what might be considered a less attractive white woman to sort of move up socially. The same thing happens, I think, with a lot of people who cannot find, say, a partner of the opposite sex. I've known, for example, the stereotype of, say, big, butch, overweight lesbians who congregate together. Do you think that there are some people, perhaps, that because of social pressures fall into a sexual role or sexual identity or a sexual relationship because of external pressures? Because human beings tend to have a certain amount of plasticity. Do you think that there's anything to that, Sven?
Well, the best example is the long history of gay men and women who marry in heterosexual relationships because they believed that was their only option, or because they couldn't imagine, because of social pressure, any other way to live their lives. So people definitely are forced into relationships that they're not necessarily happy in. I think that's been happening forever. The other types that you describe, I mean, look, there's a lot of people that have tried for decades or centuries to change people's sexual orientation, and that part just doesn't seem to work very well. So I do think that there's something very innate that can be changed. However, the type of relationships that people end up in, of course, is not biological at all, and I think there's a huge effect of, or when I say at all, there's a huge effect of environment, obviously, the type of relationships we engage in.
Let me just ask two final questions of you, and then I'll let you close, and then I'll let John close. this is more political, so this is your own personal opinion rather than scientific. And I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe in the article that I had read in Discover magazine, uh, you were quoted, or someone was quoted as saying that there was a very large percentage of homosexuals that were doing gay research, and I believe you had said that you were gay as well. And I wondered, what is your opinion on, say, the political culture within the gay rights movement, in the sense that, uh, for example, back in the 60s and 70s, you had Black Pride, and then you had Gay Pride, and logically speaking, if you're going to take pride in something, that the thing you would say, well, if I have a choice, I can only have pride if I have a choice in it. Uh, and so do you think that's just a semantic error people make? And the second thing was, uh, I've always found the term for bigotry against gay people, homophobia, to be kind of silly. And I think it sort of buys into the old kind of gay stereotype of heterosexuals, that everyone's gay and that, oh, I'm scared to be gay. Whereas I think a more realistic term might be homotedium, which would imply an uneasiness around homosexuals for whatever reason. So let me just ask you, just on a personal level, regarding the idea of gay pride and the choice of a term like homophobia in describing bigotry against homosexuals. What are your own personal opinions regarding that?
I totally agree with you on the homophobia part. It's a bad word, and it's not a phobia. I think most people are not afraid of homosexuals the same way they can be afraid of snakes or spiders. So it's a bad term, and I don't know exactly what could work better. The other question, pride. I think that I'm really not an expert here, but I think that in general, if you're a member of a minority, and that could be anything, that could be because you're born without arms, or because you're gay, or because you are of a racial minority, or anything else. I think you find support in people just like you, and you want to form a community that helps you develop your culture and develops you sort of your emotional well-being throughout life. And so I think it's kind of normal and logical that people find pride in what is often regarded as something negative by the general society.
Okay. John, are you still there?
Yep.
Okay. Let me just, while I've got good audio on you, and I'll go back to Sven, if you could just wrap up in a couple of minutes your final thoughts on the matters at hand that we've been talking about.
Now you're breaking up. Hang on, try that again,
Okay.
please.
Can you sum up in a couple of minutes your final thoughts to end the show on the subjects we've been talking about, race and sexuality in modern life? Can you hear me, John?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I think the modern world really has all of this backwards. We've finally broken free of our obsession with race starting in the 1960s, and now we've somehow gotten back into it. We're convinced that race is enormously important, racial identity is enormously important. People go around saying Black Lives Matter and getting angry at being told all lives matter. And I think, oh yeah, all the blacks are the criminals and all the whites are the police. But of course there are thousands of black police officers in the United States, and there are millions of white criminals. And then we say that gender doesn't exist and gender doesn't matter, although there is a distinctly female and better way of seeing the world, when maleness and femaleness are so primeval that homosexuals have it too. There are lesbians who are more masculine, there are lesbians who are more feminine, there are gay men who are more masculine, gay men who are more feminine, of course, and there are heterosexual men who are more feminine, but there is a fundamental core to it. There was recently a case of a transgender man to woman who had a problem getting through airport screening because she had a penis. And they said, well, gee, are you a man or a woman? And they said, I refuse to answer that question. And so the TSA said, do you want to be searched by a man or a woman? And they said, no. I mean, this is taking things just have ceased to, and it isn't necessarily to be anti-sexual, to masculine and feminine are categories that transcend physical attraction. And we need to get back to it, because this is putting women in combat. This is a terrible thing to do to women. They're like, and it's happened because finally realized that race didn't matter, gender didn't matter, and we're wrong. So
Thanks, John. Sven, if you could if you want to take a couple of minutes just to sum up your thoughts on the matters at hand.
Well, I actually like a whole lot of what John said, and I think that from my point of view as a biologist, really, I think there's a great interest in understanding how things work, just for the sake of it, and sure there may be political implications of some of the work that we've been doing, but as a biologist, you should be really curious as to how things work the way they work. I do believe that we are moving, hopefully, to a society where unimportant things matter less and less. And by unimportant, I mean a society where people can just be who they are and whoever they want to be in a way, without ignoring the fact that there's physical, biological, psychological differences between sexes and races. I think hopefully we get to a place where people can just live their lives the way they want to live and be happy the way they want to be happy, as long as they don't harm anyone. And so I think actually the next step is not, now that we have, at least here in the States, mostly equal rights for equal gay rights in a way. I think one of the next frontiers is going to a place where you, for example, have the right to not have a sex, where you don't have to be male or female. So it's not so much about transgender right, it's more about, again, the right to be just whoever you want to be.
Well, I want to thank John Robson, Sven Backlund, and also Nicholas Wade, who dropped out early in the show. Had obviously some technical difficulties. People who've watched the show before, occasionally this happens. Skype is a free service, and hopefully I can have Nicholas Wade on for a full show to talk a bit more about his ideas at a later date. But again, thank you to Sven and John. If you did enjoy this show, and I'll try to edit it to get it as best as I can, next week, it'll be a totally different topic. I'll be talking with 3 experts on the life and career of painter Andrew Wyeth. So stay tuned for that. And again, thank you to Sven and John.
You're welcome. Bye.